Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the docSHARE 2023 webinar series. From February to March, we have curated a lineup of talks with local industry experts speaking on a variety of topics pertaining to documentary craft and what goes into the pre- and post-production of executing your film. docSHARE is an initiative of the Documentary Filmmakers Association of South Africa to create opportunities for experienced film professionals to share their knowledge and engage with the work and concerns of the DFA's existing and prospective members. This session is open to the public and we appreciate your attendance. Please note, the docSHARE program is powered by the Presidential Employment Stimulus Program, PESP3, administered by the NFVF. Thank you to the NFVF for this wonderful opportunity. And today we are very happy to welcome Thandi Davids, who will be speaking about development, the start of a documentary. The talk will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A starting at 15:45. So please start thinking of your questions. A little bit about the session. Thandi will explore what your first step should be and what you should be thinking about when you have a great idea for a documentary and now need to begin the long process of actually making the film, from initial story development, competitor analysis and rights protection, to considering how you'll fund the project. How do you determine what tasks lie ahead and in what order they should be pursued? Thandi will also examine the key ingredients in a pitch deck at the development stage and what success indicators a funder or project partner may be looking for. So thank you so much, Thandi, for joining us today and for kicking off the docSHARE webinars. Please, could you briefly introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your professional background, and then dive into the topic. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. For all of those who came to listen to me, I hope I have some pearls of wisdom, but if not, you let me know at the end of the session. So my name is Thandi Davids. I am a filmmaker, both documentary and a narrative, but always with the first love for documentary. I come from a media background, a very broad media background. I'm one of those people who's had a couple of careers in my lifetime. I was born in the 20th century, not the 21st. So I'm a little old bully, as they say. But really kind of, when I started out, I wanted to become a broadcast journalist, and specifically an investigative broadcast journalist. And at the time, when I was entering into school and into the workplace, and school, I mean university, there really was an opportunity for young Black females to go into that field in any shape or form. So I really ended up going into advertising and marketing. I started out in PR, did a couple of years there. I then went on to do very massive, large-scale global events for the United Nations. I ran my own experiential marketing agency and decided, I did work for a little bit of time in broadcast policy at the Independent Broadcasting Authority. That was when we were opening up the airwaves. Prior to that, only the SABC could broadcast, and Mnet had a license at that point in time for pay TV. But there was no ETV, there was no YFM, there was no KFM or Highveld. These were all stations that weren't allowed to exist at that point in time. So I was very actively involved in broadcast policy as the country's laws changed post-1994. Following my period as a live producer, as I call it, producing shows where you only have one take, it's got to be right on the first day. I had the fortune of being headhunted to start up Fox International Channels, and there I launched 6 bespoke TV channels into Africa and ran about 11 TV channels. It was an incredibly interesting journey doing that. It was a great way for me to see what kind of content there was coming out of South Africa, coming out of Africa generally, and also to understand the problems and issues around independent filmmaking and how they engage with commissioning and getting their stories made. When I was at Fox, we came in with a very different model, and which now I think a lot of producers are starting to follow, but in those days, everyone was really used to commission, and Fox was no commissions. We do co-productions, and the world has now gone the route of co-productions in South Africa very specifically. From Fox, I was there for a number of years. I decided I really wanted to be on the producing side, and very specifically with my love for documentary, wanted to start making documentaries as quickly as I could. I've got into partnership with 2 people, Lara Colucci, who is an IP lawyer, and Neil Brunt, who's a very well-known documentarian in South Africa, an award-winning one at that. So from there, that's where I find myself now. I'm also presently the co-chair of the Independent Producers Organization. I've just ended my tenure on the founding board of the Durban Film Art Institute. So very actively involved in policy issues in the industry and trying to make sure that we have an industry that's functional for all of us now and for those that are going to come into it. And that broadly is who I am from my career's perspective. So moving on to this masterclass and deciding, doing your documentary and how you're going to get through the development process. I think, of course, everything starts with the story. So the first idea is, what is my story? I've got a great idea. Do I think it's going to work? You need to be able to very quickly flesh out for you and be able to do a 2-minute pitch. This is what my story idea is about. And this is the way I want to go about telling this particular story. So let's look at an example, like from one of my films, Influence, which we did and took to Sundance in 2020. The story really sometimes the story comes to you, sometimes it resonates in your brain, and I'll talk about the 2 different ways that happens. A story comes to you. This was 2 journalists who approached us, Richard Paplak and Dana Neal, who had worked on the Gupta leaks at that point in time. And very specifically, they wanted to do a story about the PR firm that was behind Jacob Zuma and the Guptas and what they were effectively doing in terms of weaponizing communications and specifically in the political arena. So coming to us, we looked at the story. Is there a role for the story? How would we tell the story? What is the process for us to tell the story? Great idea. We've got access to the Gupta leaks because they're both working for the Daily Maverick, and of course have access to all of those hard drives and understanding what the back end of the story is. So already we've got an inbuilt expertise that comes with these 2 people. They come with a huge amount of research, which makes your life easier as a producer. But what is key? Access. How are we going to tell the story, and through whose eyes are we going to tell the story? With Influence, we were incredibly fortunate because our protagonist gave us time and spoke to us. We were quite taken aback, but he was very old and I think dying, to be very fair, and felt that this was the one opportunity that he could voice what his thoughts were and give his side of the story. But also I think he felt that it was going to be this little South African dock house doing a documentary. No one was going to see it, which is also probably one of the reasons why he was very happy to be as open as he was. So access is fundamentally key in terms of this. And we always forget this. I think we come up with a story, we think it's a great story idea, but do you have access? So with that particular film, we had access to a huge amount of research. We had access to journalists who really understood the depth of that story. It was an easy uptake for us as producers, if I could put it that way. Where it becomes a little bit more difficult is when you're starting a story completely from scratch. And it's come to your head and your mind, and you want to tell the story. And I've seen so many people when they're pitching for development to the NFVF who come with a story idea and you say the story is completely unfeasible. There's no way you can go about making the story. So the first thing for you to do is choose your story. Do you have access to characters? Have you reached out to those characters? Are they willing to speak? And this is a really, really big part of it. I'm going through a doc series that we're producing now. Each episode has got a different protagonist, and they're quite difficult stories. And we go through 1 month where someone says, okay, I'm in and I'm on board, and the next month they're not. And you have to navigate that at the very, very outset. Do I have access? What kind of access? Am I sure I have this access? Because even when you're pitching for development funding, the first question is going to be, am I giving you money and then you can't access any of these people? So I'm wasting my money giving it to you. Access is completely and fundamentally key. You've chosen your story. You know that you've got access, and here's where the big kicker comes in. Do I have an audience? And most filmmakers forget this. I come from a broadcast background, and sometimes there are times when I see things that have been pitched to me where I go, who's the audience? Are you speaking to women? Are you speaking to South Africans? Is it meant for a global audience? Really, really fundamentally key that you understand who this is going to be. And telling me it's for a South African audience doesn't help. Really kind of hone in on exactly who am I speaking to. I'm making a feminist film. Is my audience for women? Or I'm making a feminist film. Is my audience for men? Because it tempers the tone and the way you write your synopsis, in the way that you tell your story. So understand who your key audience is. I'm making a story about being transgender. Am I speaking to my community, or am I speaking to the greater community? There are 2 different ways you're going to engage with how you present your documentary and your documentary idea if you fundamentally understand who your audience is. So audience is fundamentally important. In terms of understanding that audience, it also then allows you to decide, okay, if I don't have a built-in audience that a broadcast is going to be interested in. This is not an SABC1 documentary, or this is not a Netflix documentary. And don't think every documentary is a Netflix documentary. Every broadcaster and every streamer has an editorial policy. They are going to decide this year they're not doing any political documentaries. So it doesn't matter what you pitch to them. If it's got politics involved, they're not going to touch it. So also understand and do your research on where you're trying to get this distributed to at the very, very, very beginning. I think a lot of filmmakers wait for this once they're all the way down the process. But at the outset, you've got to say to yourself, is this for the History Channel? Is this for Netflix? Is this for Prime? Is this for BBC? Is this for Al Jazeera? So really understand this is where I'm going to go to. You may end up with someone else, but at the very beginning, know who you're trying to get as a distributor and where your distribution mechanisms are going to be. It makes it easier in terms of the way you're going to go through the development process because you're developing with an end game in mind. I'm speaking to this audience and I'm trying to go reach them via this distribution mechanism. In terms of that distribution mechanism, at the outset, do your research. Try and understand, do research if SABC is doing documentaries. What kind of documentaries are they doing? Are they focused on environmental issues? Are they focused on historical issues? Understand what the editorial policy is so that when you're going into pitch to them, you're speaking exactly to them in terms of what the editorial stance is and where you can see the editorial stance is. So do some research on what kind of documentaries your distributor or the platform you want to be on is doing at this point in time, and try to make sure that you get kind of aligned from that perspective. That's if you're going to go from that distribution perspective. If you're doing it going festival route and doing an independent route, you've got a lot more freedom to be able to do what you want, how you want, but still always keep audience in mind. Because going to Sundance, going to Berlinale, it's also about making sure you get your film sold at the end of it. So even though you may have more editorial freedom and in terms of thought, when you are producing for an independent film, understand that your end goal is still to sell your film. So you still have to think about who is going to buy my film at the end of this process. And that's fundamentally key. And this all has to start at the very beginning. You've got to be thinking this when you're thinking about the story idea in the first place. So key things, what's your story? Can you write it up in 5 minutes and get in 2 paragraphs and get people really excited? And do you have access? Then the kinds of films where you don't have access, and you need to think about this up front as well. You're doing something historical, you're going to rely heavily on archive. Is there archive? Can I access that archive? Is that archive sitting with the SABC? Is it sitting in the UK or France? Because we know as documentary filmmakers, a lot of our archive does not belong to us. It actually sits with our colonizers. So if it's sitting there, am I going to be able to afford to make this film, considering the cost of archive? And understand those things. A lot of filmmakers forget how expensive archive is. So these are things you've got to think about up front. Am I just going to be talking heads? Or am I going to use archive? Or am I going to use recreations? These are important considerations at the very beginning of your story. Don't think about it as you go through, think about it at the outset. Then you've got to sit down and start producing your documents. In your documents, even in terms of pitching for development. So you're going to have to go out and find money to develop this. Why do you need money for development? You need money to be able to do the research you need to do, and that's intensive research. Research doesn't start when you get the money with that idea. You've got to do the research up front. You've got to have money for intensive research. You've got to have money to make sure you're writing a great outline. You've got to have money to make sure that you're developing a great treatment. You've got to make sure that you've got someone who knows how to make a treatment look fantastic. We are not all graphic designers. I know some of us think we are, but we aren't. So understand that that's also resource and money that you want to spend there, and understand that there's money that goes into the development process itself. So you need to break that development process down. Firstly, you're going to pitch for that development money. So let's start and write a really beautiful 2 to 3 pager that gives an outline of why you're wanting to tell the story. It's always important about why the story, you're wanting to tell the story. So even if the story is only 1 or 2 paragraphs where you're reflecting on what the story is, you need to bring your passion into that. Why am I telling the story? Why is it important to tell the story at this point in time? Why is it important for the future in terms of telling the story if it's not resonant right now? And of course, sorry, why is it important to tell the story? Why is it important for the future? And of course, as I said, who's my target audience? Who am I telling the story to? And make sure that that is understood and practical in terms of applying for development funding itself, okay? Do your audience research. It's critically important. I mentioned this before, but the difference for me, if I'm sitting and doing grant funding, is, okay, this person really knows, A, what the story is, They've honed in on what the story is. And very often stories are very big. So you've got to try and find an angle that comes into it that hasn't been seen before. And that's key as well. Do your research on your storyline. If you're doing a story, let's say we're doing a story about Jacob Zuma. Okay, there's a lot to talk about Jacob Zuma. You don't want a biopic. You want to focus on a particular issue or arena in his life. And you've got to make sure that angle is fixed and it's clear when you're creating that 1 to 2 pages that you're going to send out as you're trying to get development money in. So that's fundamentally key from that perspective. We also need to know that in terms of that, you've got to make sure you've got a great name. Names can always change, but a catchy name is fundamentally important. I will go through a list, and if the name hits me, I'm going to go, okay, let me read that first, okay? So make sure you have a name that is reflective of your story, but that also is engaging so people can fundamentally go, great, I want to be able to click on that and read what that story is about. It's got to tell a lot about what your actual story is about, but also be quirky, fun, whichever way you want to go, serious. But you can't just say the Jacob Zuma story, for example. It tells me nothing at this point in time. In terms of that, also make sure that you've got a tagline. The tagline is literally from an advertising background. It is that 5 or 6 words that very quickly tell you exactly what this film is about. So your tagline is there, it goes straight underneath your title, and it's key because it gives your title a little bit more reflection, it tells you a little bit more about the story. The next thing you need to create is, of course, your logline. Your logline needs to be no longer than a paragraph. I think a good logline can be, 1 good sentence, 2 good sentences, but this fleshes out the story a little bit more. It gives you who the central characters are. It tells you what the basic story arc is going to be and how you're going to take that story arc forward. So that's your logline. These are the first 3 things that any reader is going to have a look at. The first 3 things that are going to say to them, okay, I'm willing to read a 2-page synopsis or a 1-page synopsis from there. Your synopsis is also fundamentally critical. Here you're introducing your storylines, you're introducing the angles that you're going to take. You're telling your audience, you're telling your reader or your audience what is different about this film, if I'm making a film about someone whose story's already been told, or why this character is so fundamentally important. And a documentary is very often character driven. So you need to make sure that you're expressing what those characters are and telling us very fundamentally why these characters are important to follow. We did a documentary, for example, on albino women for CGTN, Regina Mary, and it was really about her struggles with gender-based violence, but fundamentally about how she's picked herself up and moved herself forward. So although all these things have informed her life, who is she and what is she? And she's this wonderful, flirty, quirky individual. And it's really important that even though the story was about gender-based violence, that you bring out this incredible personality of this person, so that you understand that this journey is not just going to be this dire journey, but also some kind of reflection on how she's overcome things and the way that she's going about her life in making sure that her activism is as important as it is. And even if she's protesting on the streets with only 2 people, she's doing so with incredible gusto. And that's kind of key and very important. It would be great if you could to get quotes in from your protagonists about why it is they feel they want to go on this journey with you as a filmmaker, why they're exposing themselves and their stories, what is important for them in terms of having their story heard. I don't think a lot of filmmakers really talk about the protagonists and why they're doing it, but I think it is a nice gesture in terms of understanding why this character is also going on this journey with you. But it's not just your journey, it's their journey, and you're walking this path together. And to show that to whoever's going to give you money, I think is fundamentally important. Your synopsis really is the entry point in anything in terms of getting development funding. It's what I'm going to read as a grant maker. It's what I'm going to say, okay, great. I understand this is the film they're trying to make. Also make sure at this point in time, sorry, is there someone there? Okay, great. I think also at this point in time, make sure that, I've lost my train of thought now. Make sure that you look at the story and understand, can I do this by myself? Very often you can't do it by yourself. So I, for example, in a number of documentaries have got co-producers. I need a co-producer in America because half my story is in America and I can't afford to be flying to the States all the time. I've got a co-producer because their expertise in a particular arena. So if you're doing a crime story, you bring on board someone who really is immersed in the crime scenario in South Africa, who understands it and can bring that expertise with you. So see if you need a partner and don't be scared of that. Collaborations are so key in this industry. It's what makes us. It doesn't break us, it makes us, even if they're difficult collaborations, people bring something together at that point in time. So you've gone through and you've managed to find some money for development funding. People have liked the story idea. Now you've got to get into the serious crux of what you're doing. And herein comes the rub. I very often see applications for funding, and I'm not talking about going to the serious development where you're going to go to raising funds. You've got some funding, it's a little bit of funding. Let's say you've gotten some funding from the NFVF, but you really have a big doc, and that 200,000 from the NFVF is not going to assist you. It's going to give you a little bit of money. And now I want to be able to actually go and pitch for proper development funding, okay? Because there's 2 tiers of development funding. I want to go to Hot Docs. I want to go to Bertha. I want to go to a variety of international funders. They're going to need a little bit more robust work from you in terms of what you're doing from a development perspective. So it's not taking you all the way through the financing part, but it's about how do I raise extra development money? At this point in time, you've got to take your 200,000 from the NFVF. You've got to invest in desktop research. You've got to be able to say, great, these are the kinds of characters I want to have access to. I've got my main character, but who else do I need to be speaking to? Because it's not just your main character. Who are my experts going to be if I need to have those experts? You need to reach out to those experts and make sure they're available. Conduct little interviews with them. Do it on Zoom so you've got that on camera and you can see the engagement, that engagement is there. Make sure that you've read, if you're doing development funding, make sure that you're reading exactly what the requirements are for each fund. Many people don't. Look at what the editorial policy is. Look at the kind of films who they're developing last year in their last funding cycle. Do they have a theme for this year? Does this fit within their theme? And always make sure that every application you are making it to fit that particular funder. You cannot just do generic applications. It doesn't work that way. You've got to look at exactly who the funder is. What are their political affiliations? Why are they funding? Do they have themes they're funding this particular year? What are the kinds of films they have funded before? If it's an environmental film, what kind of environmental films are they funding? And what has happened to those films in terms of their life cycle? So the research is fundamentally important in terms of where you're going to go to raise that particular money. Once you've got all of your development money in place, and sometimes it's also good if you have access to a camera, even if it's your phone, just to have some audio visuals that make people realize you've gone out, you've done your research, you've spoken to people, you've filmed, you're getting a sense of what you're trying to tell in terms of the story. So you've done this, you're now going to put together a fairly decent pack, and this is where the hard work comes in. First and foremost is research. Even if you've got access to a character, you've got to have research. You've got to have someone who delves into their background. And I'll give you a very practical example. At National Geographic, we commissioned a documentary on transgender Africans. We had gone through a very robust process of choosing which characters we were going to have. There were multiple characters. One of the characters we chosen was someone who had had a sex change up in Mpumalanga. She was an ex-biker, very vocal. We did our research and found out that she had some incredibly racist social media postings. So if we hadn't done that, we would have gone all the way through shooting and then found this out. So up front, even with your characters, you have to know who they are and what they are. If they're racist and that's part of your story, fantastic, but know it. What you don't want to do is be caught unawares, and this research has to happen up front, be caught unawares, not understanding who your characters are, not just your protagonist or your central character, but all those you are surrounding them with. Understand exactly who they are. Understand the depth of your story. If you're doing a crime story, do research on the particular elements within that particular crime arena, whether it's from digital crime to fraud, to whatever it is, white collar crime, whatever crime you're doing, understand your research and understand the background around that, because these are questions that are going to get asked. On Senzo, for example, that we did with Netflix, there was a deep concern about doing a story that hadn't gone through court yet. How do we handle that? What's going to be our editorial policy in terms of telling the story when we don't know what the outcome is at this point in time? These are things you have to take and consider upfront, and it needs to be done in your development process so you've got answers to any of the questions that a potential funder may have in terms of problematic areas within your storylines. So that's kind of key for this. So research is fundamental in terms of both characters, but the back end of your story as well. It also allows you to understand how much archive you are going to require. And the reason you need to understand this now is because when you put your budget together or your finance plan together, if you've got a massive archive budget, it's got to go in there. People in South Africa forget archive. I've seen so many applications or so many of these things where you say, where's your archive? And do you know archive is going to cost you 3 times the amount that your shoot is, and you haven't budgeted for that. So really understand up front when you go through your research process, what your archive is and what archive is available. In your research document, you literally need to put down, this is where archive is, these are where the interviews are, this is radio, this is audio, this is print media, and I can find this here. So know exactly where your archive is and what you're going to be requiring. It needs to be understood in your development process, because as you go through try to fundraise, this becomes incredibly important. So never forget archive. That's fundamentally important in terms of research. Also, you can't do all the research yourself. Find someone who is a researcher, who knows the art of doing it, and make sure you write a proper brief. The key thing we don't do as filmmakers, I've spent years in advertising, you have to write a brief. In writing that brief for your researcher, you begin to understand your story even better. So practical example, if you're doing something historical, do various timelines. If it's female-centered, you've got to do a timeline on the history of Africa at the time, the history of South Africa at the time, the history of feminism at the time. These are just great pointers to allow you to understand the backdrop of your story. So timelines are incredibly important in terms of where you're telling your story and what your timeline is. So make sure in terms of your brief, you're briefing these things in, okay? In terms of your brief, your research also has to be able to say, these are the people I want to interview. This person is old, so it's time sensitive. I need to interview them first. How do I get hold of them? What are their numbers? What are their contact details? You may not want to reach out to them during the development process because your story may be controversial, but understand where they are, who they are, and how they fit into your story. This is all part of your research process. And why is this important? Because you may not be directing it. You're a producer. So some of you may be producer directors, but a lot of you are producers. So you may not be directing it. And it's fundamentally important when you bring the director in that you've already had your thought process go through this, so they can come in and not have to expend that amount of time and research. They're still going to go down their rabbit holes. But for you, you've developed the story to a point where your director can come in and go, okay, great. I grasp where you're trying to tell the story from. I'm going to brief this research a little bit more. I want to look into these archives and see what's in these archive folders so that I can pull this together from my perspective and understand what the story is. Your next step after you've gone through this robust research process, and give yourself time to do it. I know a lot of people think it takes a year to make a film. It does not. It takes very many years, as we all know. Give yourself some time to go through that research process, to have a back and forth with your researcher, because very often your researcher will find storylines you didn't even know existed. You know, you may go into this research process with one story and discover a storyline and a plot line that is so fascinating that you want to explore that a little bit more. That's the joy of research. It opens up the world of your story to much broader, in a much broader way than what you were just thinking originally. It allows you to kind of look at the entire world of the story you're trying to create and see if there are more angles that you may want to touch on that you hadn't thought of from an upfront perspective. We then try to start working with our director, and if you are the director, great. But the key thing is to do a story outline. How am I going to tell the story? Am I breaking the story up into 3 acts? What will each act look at? And be able to give a reader and a funder the opportunity to be able to go, okay, I see how the story is going to develop. And your story outline does not have to be 55 pages. It can be 55 pages, but it doesn't. And take note, 55 pages is a lot to read. You've also got to understand that the person on the other side is reading millions, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures. So you make sure that you're doing a great storyline, but do it in a way that is succinct and quick and easy for them to get through, that they can read very quickly and become passionate about the project very quickly. If something is too long and I mire down and it's taking too long to get to the point, I'm going to put it aside and read the next one that's going to engage me a lot faster from a funder's perspective or from a broadcaster's perspective. So creating that story outline also makes sure you understand exactly what this film is going to look like. We know it's dark, things are going to change as you're out in the field, but it gives you a better sense of where you are going with the story, how you want the story to engage, working with your director in terms of it. The second thing it does for you is it allows you to see how archive heavy you're going to be. It allows you to see how you're going to shoot. It also allows you to say, you know what, my audience is, I'm doing a music documentary. I want it for Netflix. this is the way I'm going to have to shoot this, working with the director in terms of it. This is the way we're thinking of shooting this, and I'm going to write the storyline to keep that in place. The director then takes that and goes off and creates a treatment. And a treatment is fundamentally important for a number of reasons, okay? The treatment is there to give voice to the director's vision, what this director is trying to do with it. It's there to introduce your characters and what you're trying to say about your characters. It's there to outline the plot of what you're trying to do. It's there to kind of make sure that the story what is the crux of my story? What is the highlight of my story? What am I trying to teach? What am I trying to tell? But most of all, and very importantly, it's visual. And very often I don't see treatments that are fundamentally visual. There's a lot of words, and that's great, but we are a visual medium. So visuals are fundamentally important. And that means you've got to sit down and do picture research. It takes days to do picture research for a pitch deck, for treatment. It takes days. You've got to sit down, go through what images are going to work right, go through the copy you're utilizing inside your deck, make sure that the images are there and the correct images. And you can't just pull everything off the net. You've got to make sure you've got the right images. It's fundamentally important. With your director, make sure you understand what the tone is, what lighting are you going to use, what kind of mood are you setting? Are you trying this to be big and glossy? Is it trying to be gritty? Is it heartfelt? Really understand what it is and what kind of feeling and emotion you're wanting to create inside the film, and have that reflected in your treatment. The first thing is, I'm not that interested in the cameras you're going to use. Yes, they're great. I'm interested in what those cameras are going to create. So you can talk about the cameras, but very frankly, I've seen pitch decks where there are 4 pages about cameras. I don't want to know about the cameras. What I want to know is what that camera is going to do. How's that going to look? And that's fundamentally important. It's, as I said, we're an audio-visual medium. You have to use visuals. You've got to bring the story alive through visuals. We all know they're not necessarily going to be exactly the kind of things that the way your film is going to look, but it's about giving a sense and taste and almost smell to your reader in terms of what you're trying to do with this particular treatment. It's also important for your director to give their vision. It's not your vision, you're the producer, the director's vision. What are they trying to do? What story are they trying to tell? Why is the story important for them? For example, I have a pitch coming up next month. It's a slate pitch, so I've got to pitch a number of films, but each film is a different director. I can't have those directors in the room with me. And although we have a little their blurb and the director's statement, what I've also asked them to do is to do a little 2-minute video to tell my audience and our audiences and those people we're pitching to why they're so passionate about this project. It's incredibly important that your director believes in the project. They're not just there to direct, they've got to believe in it, and that's got to come through and resonate. In terms of your pitch deck, you need to, as I said, make it as beautiful as possible. There are a couple of key things that need to go into that pitch deck. You've got to know that you've got to be able to do your big cover and make it look cover, the name of it. Once again, your tagline, your log line, your synopsis needs to go in there. You've got to have a little blurb about your characters and why they're fundamentally important to you. You've got to also look at who your audience is. Once again, this is who my audience is. I'm speaking to these people. This is what my audience looks like. You've also got to try and give them films that are like your films. They don't have to be the film that it's going to be, but this is the type of film I'm trying to make. You know, if I'm trying to do a true crime story, I'm going to use Filthy Rich as what I'm doing a doc series. I'm going to use Filthy Rich, and this is the way I'm going to use Filthy Rich. I'm now talking very specifically about doing this from a feature doc perspective. When you're doing a pitch deck for a series, it's a lot more work because you have to have some kind of outline of each of your episodes. But the key thing on a series is concentrate on episode 1. Really flesh out what episode 1 is going to be about, and that flows into the rest of the episodes. You don't have to go in detail for each of the episodes, but you need to know exactly what is happening in each of the episodes and how they relate to each other. And that's key as well. So make sure that happens. From there, the other key thing is in terms of applying for local funding, we don't really need the audio visuals, but internationally, you'll be asked for audio visuals. So this means that part of what you need to do in terms of fundraising is to get money for a trailer, okay? And it's always better to shoot part of your trailer. You can go ahead and use a lot of archive, but it's always great because it gives your reader an understanding of how you're going to ask questions, how you're going to shoot this, okay? You'll look at something like hot docs, which we've looking at applying to recently. They will say to you, can you please send photographs, just photographs of a shoot that you're doing? You need to create a trailer, and that trailer needs to be twofold. There should be about a 4-minute trailer that allows you to kind of tell your story very quickly. And there should be about a 10-minute trailer, which allows you to go a little bit more in depth and almost gives a sense of what the film is going to be like. So 2 different trailers, depending on who you're applying to funding for, those trailers become important. Your character needs to be part of that trailer so you can actually show that you do have real access. So inside this thing, as I said, you're going to have this, you're going to have your log line, you're going to have your synopsis, you're going to have your tagline, you're going to then effectively talk about your characters, who they are, the central characters or bios in terms of them. You're going to present yourself as a producer. You're going to present your director. You're going to present anyone else you're co-producing with. That's completely key. If you're in a co-production, each of the production houses are involved also need to be presented with their credentials. Okay, your trailer needs to really be emotive. It needs to pull an audience in. If you've shot something, make sure you do it. You use the right rushes that you're effectively using to make this trailer up. Okay, so key, go through that editing process. It also hones your mind in terms of the way, the look and feel in the story that you're trying to tell. So that's fundamentally key. Once you go into this process and in the development process, you also need to start thinking about budget. How much is this going to cost me? I'm only shooting in Northwest Province. I think I can do this for R1 million. Great, I've got R1 million budget. But as I said, once again, people will say R1 million, and you ask the question archive, okay? And archive is going to cost you 500,000 Rand. So your budget's actually 1.5 million Rand, okay? Have you included post? Because you've got to think about post. Am I using animation of this? If it's an animation, great idea, I'm using animation. What's the cost of the animation? What's the cost of post-production and having to integrate live action animation? That's an entire story in its own, okay? These are things as you're going through that development process, as you're writing your story outline, that you have to think about and what the cost implications are going to be in terms of that. Why is that key and important? Because who are you going to go to money for? You know, you can make a doc for R1 million, you can make a doc for 15 million Rand. But raising 15 million Rand as a South African filmmaker is hell of a hard, okay? So understand exactly what your budget parameters are for this, because that is going to tell you how you're writing your pitch deck, who you're speaking to in terms of funders, and how you're speaking to them in terms of funders. So all the way through, you've got to be thinking about budget. If I want to do recreations, can I afford recreations? You know, I've seen people come up with ideas of we're going to do recreations and I'm going to have 150 people on set. That is really, 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 really crazy. We are not doing a drama. Recreations are meant to be there in order to kind of elevate your story. And you shouldn't be thinking about them first. You should be thinking about them last. The reason why you're thinking about them last, you are a documentary filmmaker. There are other ways to tell the story before recreations. Recreations come when you say, okay, there's a hole over here and I think I need to lift this up a little bit and put those recreations in. Don't start with recreations, and that's kind of key. So your treatment is great. You've got your trailer, you've got a great budget parameter, and now you've got to do a finance plan. What's a finance plan? How am I raising this money? I intend going to the NFVF. They're going to give me R1 million in production. I intend using the DTI rebates. I intend going to international funders. This is what my plan is, and this is how I'm going to raise my money. The fundamental thing to understand in terms of your finance plan is if you're going to look for money internationally, you first have to find money locally. It is easier to raise international funding if they see an investment from someone local. So realize that your first port of call is going to be finding your local money before you go internationally, and you've got to craft your treatment in that particular way. How am I finding my local money? Where am I finding it before I move on to the next point? Then, of course, it's where can I raise the money? I alluded to this a little bit earlier on. You've understood your target market. You know that this potentially is a You've seen what Prime has done and the kind of documentaries they do. You think this is perfect for them. So fundamentally, you've got to make sure this deck speaks to their audience. This is who I'm going to. I'm going for a full commission, and my rights are going to be gone. It's going to belong to Prime, but I'm designing it specifically to go to Prime. Or I'm holding on to my IP and I'm going to cobble together all this money. I'm going to go into a co-production. I'm going to raise money from hot docs. Who am I speaking to? Does my treatment work right with this? Are they interested, and will they be interested? And also, do not put people in terms of your finance plan who may not be interested in this. If this doesn't resonate with a particular funder, don't say in your finance plan, I'm going after this funder, knowing full well this is not the kind of story that they will want to tell. And the reason why is because another fund is going to look at this and go, this person doesn't know where they're funding from. They don't understand what the funding process is. So you're researching who you're funding and how you're funding, and taking this to market from that particular perspective is important. Knowing who you're going to, because your finances are going to look at who else you are raising funding with, and whether that works with them, and whether you're actually on the right track and understand what your film is fundamentally. In terms of that, another key thing is understanding the application process. Not every application is the same. They change from year to year. Themes change. What's sexy changes. What's interesting for audiences changes. So you can't say, I entered hot docs this year this way. You've got to relook at it. And you may have to go back 2 or 3 years in a row. It's a long haul. But understand exactly who you're speaking to. Make sure your deck speaks to them. Make sure you're reading exactly what they require. If they need a 5-minute trailer, put in a 5-minute trailer. If they need a 10-minute trailer, make sure there's a 10-minute trailer. If they don't need a trailer, but they need to see you film something, make sure you've gone out and filmed. And as you start your development process, understand what those requirements are going to be at the outset. I know I'm going to need a trailer because I'm applying to these kinds of people. So at the outset, you know that a trailer's got to be part of your storyline. Some films don't need trailers. I've got films that we hopefully are now selling, but we haven't had to do a trailer because they've loved the story so quickly and they've gotten it so quickly. But most films do, and especially when you're doing this internationally, because they don't know where you come from. They don't know where you come from. So you've got to bring that to life for them, and they need to understand exactly where you are coming from. I think I've spoken a lot, and I know that I'm being told to wrap up, so there's Q&As, and I hope we can unpack a little bit of that from here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thandi. So far, we have 2 questions, and we encourage as many questions as possible. So we'll start off with Mpho. Mpho's asking about when you have an outline and you break it down into acts, do you have to do it scene by scene, or how should it be written?
No, I think it's broadly the acts. You don't have to go scene by scene. I mean, I have seen when people have gone all the way down the route where they've done it scene by scene, but it doesn't have to be scene by scene. In fact, quite often if you're doing it scene by scene, it becomes a little bit discombobulated. It's really the narrative story that you're trying to do. So, act 1, do a page and a half to outline what you're going to do there. Act 2, act 3, and do it that way. That for me makes a lot more sense than giving an absolute breakdown, scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. It's not necessary in my mind.
And thinking about selection criteria for co-producers, please could you unpack the journey of going about this process, and what are some of the key elements and considerations for selecting the right co-producer or multiple co-producers for a documentary? And this question is from Palesa.
Thanks, Palesa. So I think co-producing there's a number of ways of doing it. We have come on board as co-producers on films because our access and reach and our understanding of how to raise funding internationally was key for that particular filmmaker. So in the discussions with us, it was, look, I've got the story idea, I've done the treatment, I've done all of this work, but I don't know how to go out and raise funding. We know that you can we come on board? There's a couple of things. So you may look at it from that perspective, but remember this is a marriage and a film is a very long haul. Everyone thinks it's finished once you've made the film and you've done the awards. No. You still got to distribute, you're still making money, you're still doing all of those things. You together for a couple of years to come. So remember, think about it as a marriage on one level. There has to be a comfortability with each other. And I'm going to talk about the human side of things, that you like working with each other and you can see yourselves working with each other. Don't go and choose someone where you already know that they irritate you as a human being, because that's just going to get 1,000 times worse as you're going through it. So the key things is, what is it that co-producer is bringing to the table for me? Am I wanting someone who is strong editorially, because I love the editorial way they make films, and I want that person to work with that person from an editorial perspective. So I've watched their films, I've seen them out in the marketplace, and I love the editorial view, and I want to work with them in terms of editorially creating the story together. Am I looking for someone who's got more experience in terms of fundraising? Am I looking for someone who is award-winning and knows how to create films that resonate within the various festivals? Is that what I'm looking for? So really understand exactly what it is you're looking for in a partner. Is it someone to help you raise money and to go out to market together with? Is it editorial? Is it about making sure that you want to win awards and that your film is doing that? Choose your co-producer if you're co-producing in terms of what exactly your needs are, and they're bringing something to the table that you may not necessarily have at that point in time.
We have a question from Simon. How many times should we retry after being rejected a few times before calling it quits?
You know, sometimes a story is just at the right time. You may have a really fantastic story, and it just sits, you try year after year, and you've got to say, you know what, I'm putting that baby to rest for a little bit. I'm going to go and think and work on other projects. And 2 or 3 years later, an opportunity comes. So stories don't go away. They just sometimes, you know, as my business partner likes to say, we put them in the fridge, okay? They haven't gone away. They're always there. We put them in the fridge. Understand that you also look at what your application is looking like. Has your application changed fundamentally from last year to this year? Have you made it more robust? Do you think your characters are working out? Maybe you should have a different character. Maybe there's a more interesting character. And this again goes to that research process. If you've done your research, you may find an angle that you hadn't been thinking of before, that you say, okay, now I've done this research. In fact, when I apply next time, I'm going to apply with this storyline. So it's an ongoing process to review in terms of that. But as I said, don't think it may just be a time issue. It may not be the right time to be telling the story. The world isn't in the mood for it at this point in time. But keep on trying and leave it for a year. You know, leaving it for a year, you going off and doing other things, things may resonate. You may come back and look at things differently and redo that application completely. And who knows, year 5, you get it because you've rethought of the story in a different way.
Simply, your hands up, please go ahead and ask your question. I think you're on mute. Okay, we're going to move to Wake's question. Do you pay participants for access?
So here is a very big debate that is happening within the doc arena. Traditionally, no, you don't. That is always the way it's been. It's been like being a journalist, you don't. But the world has shifted and changed. So some doc people do. It's a nominal fee. They'll do it after the interview's been done, if I could put it that way. So some documentarians do. It's a very big debate at this point in time. From our perspective, we choose not to. When we have paid people, we've paid them for archive. Remember, in this day and age, people's personal photographs are worth money. Their social media is worth money. So for us, if there has been a payment to any of our protagonists or our characters, it's generally because we paid them for archive more than what we've paid them for an interview itself. We don't believe in that, but as I said, there's a very big debate raging across the globe about exactly that. You've got to, for me, from an ethical perspective, you've got to seriously consider if it's going to impact what that person is saying to you. One of the reasons why we don't do it is because, oh, I'm paying someone to actually say what I want them to say. That's really the reason why people have not paid for interviews. So the ethical, it becomes ethically a little difficult, but I think I would leave it up to each of you. But from our perspectives of documentarians at StoryScope, we don't pay for interviews. We just think it ethically, it creates a murky arena where people can throw accusations about the fact that you actually, this person's telling the story because you've told them to tell the story this way, as opposed to it being their truth.
Hi, I was struggling to find where to unmute my voice. It's my whole thing. I wanted to ask, so when we applied for funding, the tiers that there's tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. What I want to know is, when does a person move from tier 3 to tier 2 or from tier 2 to tier 3?
Okay, so tier 3 generally are first-time filmmakers. From an NFVF perspective, it's the first-time filmmakers, it's people coming into the market with their first film. The way it would work is they would say you probably give you money for a short film. It's generally what tier 3s apply for. Once you've got 1 or 2 short films under your belt, so I would say 1 or 2, about 2, they probably then say, okay, I'm applying for my first feature, or you've done your first feature as a tier 3. Once you've done your first feature or your first series, they say 1 or 2 features or series, you move into tier 2. Once you've done more than 2 or 3 or 4 of those, you move into tier 1, broadly speaking.
Okay, so do you need to have showcase them somewhere, or do they need to make money, or what are the conditions of moving from the tiers?
Tier 1 films don't necessarily have to have made money. It's really about showing your craft and the fact that you have the ability to be able to tell a story on camera, that you've gone through the process you need to, and that you've been able to handle the post and deliver a fully fledged product. So really tier 1 is your time for experimenting. It's just to be able to, you know, those short films, we call them business cards. It's your ability to be able to go into another producer or to go into a fund and say, look, I've actually done this and I know how to construct a story, even if it is only 20 minutes long. I know how to construct a story and I can showcase this from that particular perspective. And that's really what that tier 1 is there for. So the requirement for it to have exhibition is not high in terms of tier 1s. But I do think when you start getting to tier 2, they would expect exhibition of some sort, yes.
Hamilton, please go ahead and ask your question. You're on mute.
Yeah, Thandi, can you hear me now?
Thanks
for really, really wonderful presentation. Really, really struck a lot of bells with me. I'm just going back to this paying people for, not for interviews, but for their time. You know, if you need access, which we all agree you do, very often you're taking 2 or 3 days out of them, particularly if they're people who are poor and who are trying to scratch a living from their own little selling fit cook or something like that. So I personally feel that if you make it very clear to the people up front, I'm paying you for your time, I'm not paying you for what you say.
Yeah.
And very often I only give it at the end of an interview. I just wondered if you had a thought on that.
Look, I mean, I absolutely, I think that's absolutely the right thing to be doing. And I do know that filmmakers, as I said, we've done it and we've only done it at the end. We haven't said up front, I'm giving you money, but we have said, okay, this person's given us 3 days. Here's a stipend for the time you've given us. So we have done that for time, but we don't say, I will never go into an interview negotiating payment up front. It really changes the timbre of what you're trying to do from our perspective. But as I said, people have different attitudes in terms of the way they work. But from our perspective, paying for time it doesn't cross an ethical boundary as long as you're doing it at the end of the process and not promising money at the outset, which I think is key.
Tessa is asking, when you're busy doing research development and pre-production, how do you value your own time, i.e. how much of your budget should you justify using to pay yourself as a producer?
Oh, this is always the big debate. I would probably say no more than about 10% of budget. If you can, you've got to, you remember that you've got, there's producer fees, which is the one thing, but remember when you've got a budget, you've got to put all the other things that you're doing in there as well. And people forget this. There has to be overheads in there. There's got to be the cost of your office space. There's got all of those things are in there as well. That's not part of the producer fee. So the producer fee really needs to be just for your time effectively. It shouldn't be covering the nuts and bolts of what you're doing, rent, this, that, the other, that needs to go into budget itself. But I would say, I mean, I think we range probably about around 10% plus or minus that we try and look at in terms of producers' fees from our perspective.
Motla Lepule, please could you ask your question?
Hi everyone. Before I continue, I ask my question, picking from Hamilton, with paying the character, like sometimes you kind of like need to pay the character, like let's say it is the main character, like your story is all built around the character, wouldn't they want something in return to give their story and all that? From a journalist perspective, I understand like you can't pay for the story for the sake of ethics and morals and all that, but then with a documentary, isn't it a little bit different? Continuing with that, like sometimes you do find that you have like reenactments on your documentary and you have professional actors right there, right? So what happens? You pay in those characters. Wouldn't your main character that's been reenacted feel like they also wanna get paid somehow? And secondly, back to development and all that, I'd like to know, is the script development, script writing, like is it part of development, or you do it on a pre-production? Where does it fit, like your script, like when
okay, so just in terms of paying characters, I mean, this is the difference between documentary, is that we don't, it's about telling a true story from a real place at the end of the day. So negotiating fees up front very often shifts and changes the way that character presents themselves on camera, and there's almost an expectation that they start talking to you in terms of what they think you are wanting from them, and that's what the danger is, and with the fine line you're working. If you're paying for actors to do recreations, it's a very different story. It's narrative, and it works differently. But in terms of saying to a character up front, I'm doing, for example, I'm doing a music industry thing at the moment, and it's been very difficult to negotiate. We are not paying this artist to appear on this documentary, but we have to negotiate her publishing rights, the rights to use her song, the rights to use this, the rights to use those footage, that kind of stuff we're negotiating and we're paying for, but we're not physically paying for her to be in the documentary itself. So I think it's a very listening line to walk. And as I said before, what a lot of us do is we won't say there's going to be a stipend. We want people to engage in the story in the truest level that they can. And at the end of it, say, thank you very much for your time. And this is what I can give you in terms of time. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to tell stories. Every time you open up a door and ask, can I interview you? It's going to be, can I please have 5,000 Rand for 2 minutes? So, yeah. Then you asked about script writing. In doc, we only pay per script once we've started shooting. So we don't need scripts beforehand. Because remember, your story only unfolds as you are filming. You don't know what your characters are going to say. You may have done all the research, you've got a great story outline, but until you physically sit with someone for a day or 2 or 3, or follow them for 4 months, you actually have no idea what you're going to get out of them. So we only start scripting once we've got all that footage in, we've looked at the rushes, we've seen what the great storyline is going to be, and then we paper script. We basically take those interviews, we put them into a script, we see if we need a narrator, or if we don't need a narrator, where the questions we need to go back and re-ask. So that really only starts happening once we start shooting. You may have a shoot script, which is like, we're going to shoot this, and these are the questions I'm going to ask. That's a shoot script, so it gives you an outline of what you're asking when you're going into shoot. But in terms of a proper script, that only starts happening after we start filming and we've got the stuff in.
We are at 5 o'clock. Thank you so much, Thandi, for these fascinating and really critical insights. Thank you to everyone who's attended for your questions and your engagement. Please tune in for our next docSHARE webinar on Thursday, the 23rd of February, with filmmaker Jessie Zinn on budgeting for short films. Thank you and see you next time.